Welcome to Startup Wins. Twice a month, we share real stories and smart tips. Subscribe and join the journey.
Hello, Startup Wins listeners. Thank you for allowing us into your homes, your cars, or wherever you're either listening or watching our podcast. In season 1, on our startup podcast, we were blessed with 12 fantastic founders, VCs, and building experts like String Win, a former LinkedIn top voice who helps you with your branding on social media, or Olga Denisova, who helps SEMrush, the world's top SEO startup, market their way into IPOing and being over $1 billion in market cap. Today, I'm going to share specific answers from some of our wonderful guests in a best of recap episode because you really need to hear their answers. Questions from how do you hire the perfect team to is it okay to manage your startup with a stick versus the carrot? Or what type of personality does it really take to become a startup founder? Starting off, let's listen to Dan Shapiro, 4-time Seattle startup founder who exited to Google for a handsome sum, life-changing money actually, he said, with SparkBuy, and now heads Glowforge, a 3D printing company that hit $100 million in annual revenue in 2022. He shares his candid thoughts on what it's like to build great startup teams. I feel like startup founders probably struggle with right at the beginning of any organization, and that is building of the team. So you obviously had to build the team with SparkBuy, and then you had to build the team with Glowforge, but maybe you had a little more money with Glowforge. Can you walk through a little bit of your thinking and how you perhaps approach this whole, possibly in my opinion, one of the most important steps in building a startup?
It's a disaster. Building a team is just so freaking brutal and thankless. You start with the founding teams, and I did a little research on this for my book, but the short version is pick basically any startup a tech startup that became a multi-billion-dollar success, and you will find a broken founding team with founders who didn't make it to the end, right? Like Microsoft, Oracle, you go through and every one of them had Facebook, see the movie, the original founders, and then the people who actually made it. And there was always a bad decision in the first one. And while it's a little hard to see the data, also almost every exec who the startup hires gets fired at some point, and leaves. It's just natural. Look at the number, at the first execs and look at the final execs. The best case is they did a great job and they were great for their role for a while and then, moved on. But often it's that, no, they weren't the right person and, had to be swapped out. And I think one of the biggest challenges is you just have to have a tremendous degree of humility as an executive about your own ability to pick people. You do your best and then you learn from what you've done and you iterate, and sometimes you have to part ways with folks and sometimes bring new folks on. It's the worst thing, absolute worst thing. Parting ways with folks is the one part of my job that brings me closest to crying on a human level. I don't get deeply heartbroken about losing money or missing out on a business opportunity. I feel that way about impacting somebody's livelihood. And there isn't, as far as I know, there isn't any Rosetta Stone that's going to tell you, this person is the person who's going to do that job perfectly. It's funny because when I talk to colleagues who, who I've grown with, who I know well, and who are people who I deeply trust, I will often say, fellow executives who work for me, I will be like, I don't trust my gut. I'll say this all the time. People are like, what are you talking about? I'm like, oh, I have a terrible gut for this person's going to be great. This person's going to be terrible. My gut is easily influenced. It's subject to all sorts of nonsense and signals that don't make sense. The person dresses sloppy or dresses well. The person talks like me or doesn't talk like me. Heaven knows what level of biases. Those are all my gut. So when I'm interviewing, it's all about let's solve problems together. Let's talk about how we work together. Let's talk about what you're looking for. And the whole time I'm assuming that any sufficiently experienced executive is likely to be telling you what you want to hear, not what is closest to the truth, because great executives have the experience to be able to fill gaps, and you're coming to them with a gap and they're going to do their best to fill it. So it's really hard to beat somebody who you've worked with before, where you have that experience. It's really hard to beat somebody where you have a shared network and understand their experience. It's really, and at the end of the day, you look for the experience you need, you look for the person who's the best fit, and then you try it. Hope to heck it works out. But it's pretty tough, and I wish I could say something other than luck is a huge portion of it. Luck is a huge portion of it.
Next up, Kim Kovacs, a 7-time startup founder who's been on both sides of the aisle as an operator and a funder. She shares what she was like as a youth, possibly pointing out to what startup founders who succeed are like as kids.
I really started kind of my entrepreneurial journey when I was about 10 years old. And I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I started selling beer at the age of 10 because we literally lived right downtown where the stadium is. So when Michigan would have its football games, we'd have about 100,000 people that would walk by our
Nice.
house. And I was literally selling everything that I could find out of the refrigerator and then some. So sodas and water and snacks and this. I tried to sell my sister. That didn't really work. And so I would sell beer. And it was interesting because the frat guys next door would actually bring it. And I would, kind of cut them in on the deal because who's going to say no to a 10-year-old selling beer? I mean, come on. And then I employed one of my neighbors like 3 doors down or like 3 streets down because the guys would like drink the beer and walk with it, and then they would need a place to throw the can or bottle when they were done. And so my neighbor friend would collect all the bottles, and at that time it was a 10-cent refund in Michigan. So we were making money at the beginning and I'm making money at the end, and my cost of sales was 0 because I was getting my beer for free. So it was a really great business model until, my mom found out. And then she said, okay, we're going to shut this one down. So that was kind of my bug. That was kind of my thing of, kind of finding these opportunities and really kind of maybe approaching things in a little bit of a different way, which has always been sort of my forte. So I have had startups in the fintech world, the clean tech world. I've invested in companies that were in biotech and various other things. I seem to kind of trend a little bit more towards technology, but I
Right.
think there's also other areas that need kind of a technical mindset in the startup world. So now I'm in materials. And so, it's been a little bit of an evolution, but that's kind of where I got to where I'm at today.
Next, Kim shares how you work on the cap table. Some really great advice. So this is the 7th time you've built a cap table, and you have all this knowledge in building a company that builds cap tables. How did you approach this cap table? And it also, I didn't know the company was this new. So
Yeah.
it sounds like there's a lot of great opportunity for other angels possibly right now, right?
Yes,
And maybe even
absolutely.
VCs. Do you mind sharing a little bit how you thought about the cap table and how maybe you would recommend to other people how they think about cap tables?
Yes. So a couple things is that I am not stingy when it comes to the cap table. I
Mm,
was early in my
mm,
career and probably my first couple of startups. Every share mattered. Like it was almost painful giving away some stock sometimes,
mm, mm,
to
mm,
people.
mm,
And what I realized throughout this is your cap table initially is a starting point.
mm,
It's not your ending point,
mm,
right? So if you are going into a business and you're like, I don't want to bring on investors, I don't want to dilute down, I want to still own this, then don't raise money,
mm,
you know? Because then you're going to be always at odds with your investors because they want to see performance. They're part of this. They're providing the capital and all this behind it, right? So part of your cap table strategy for me, the biggest thing I look at is who's my last funder and how much do I want to give them?
mm.
Or how much are
Interesting.
they going to require? And for what am I getting for that? So let me use the example of optionees. So I had some angel investors in. So I had Tech Coast Angels, I had Pasadena Angels, I had other couple of angel groups, I had individual angels. Myron Scholes was actually on my cap table, which was really awesome.
Mm,
So I had a bunch of angels in. Then I had a VC, which was Miramar Ventures. And then I was going after some larger dollars before I sold the company.
mm,
And I had deployed William Blair to be my banker. And my last funder, I wanted Emergence Capital to be my last funder. That was
mm.
my
Wow.
goal,
Interesting.
And I said, you know what? They took, Salesforce public. They did all these great things. I know them. They know of me. I know what I need to do to get their capital into this company. This is what this company needs to look like. And I even vetted with them. It was really funny. I had a great relationship with a couple of the guys there. And I would call them up and I'd say, just information. I go, would you mind just sharing 15 minutes with me? And they say, yeah. And I said, I want your money, but I'm not asking for it today. What do I have to do to get there? Who do I need on my board? What kind of people do I need on my team? How much money do I have to have raised? What is my, recurring revenue, my, monthly recurring revenue need to look like? What is my, all of the metrics, what do I have to get you to invest? And I know you want a third of the company at the time you do it, right? So I was playing my cap table from backwards forwards, right? So knowing that they are going to be this much, knowing that I need this much in a team, I realized, what am I going to be left with, right?
Right.
And how can I leverage other access to capital or other things? I love, by the way, convertible notes. I love them. The reason I love them is because you don't have to have that early discussion on valuation, right? You're going to have a discussion about valuation for the entire time you're going to have your company. It's always going to be that way, right? Your cap table is going to get beaten up. You're going to have a conversation about valuation. If you can defer that as you're building value, why not, right? It's like a free interest rate on a credit card.
Right.
Take advantage of the stuff that you can get right now to be able to give you the fuel that you need to build to that valuation. So that's what I did early on, and that's what I do pretty much for every one of the companies that I have. I do convertibles right out of the gate. I know David Burkus's 3-2-1 formula, just like everybody else does, Every startup's worth $1 million and you're going to give away 30 to 40% in an angel round.
Interesting.
Right? I mean, it's kind of like there's no revenue, it's early stage, it's this, you may or may not have I mean, it's the same formula for a lot of the angel investors. So I love the convertibles. I love a KISS. I love a SAFE. I think there's hybrids now that are really awesome. You don't have to spend a lot of money on legal, which is also a great thing, And yeah, you're kicking the can down the road, but I like it. So your question was really about the cap table. So for me, as a founder, I had to always decide, what do I want at the end of this? How much time am I going to put in? How much money am I going to commit my own capital? Which, by the way, I've done that for every single startup. It's not just my time, but it's also my money that I put in. And no, it's not a loan to the company. Nobody likes paying back founders for anything. Learned that one. But I always said, okay, so if I want 10% of $1 billion company, do I want 20%? Do I want 30%? And that's going to dictate who I bring on the team, other co-founders. So that's the other thing is I'm not stingy on my cap table. I want other co-founders with me. So right now Renew has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We have 5 co-founders on Renew, and we all are coming and bringing value. And I lean on them just as much as they lean on me, right?
Yeah, no.
And so for myself, I will never also have another company where I'm a sole founder.
And finally, Kim shares some very creative aspects of startup financing you might not ever get in a startup podcast or even in real life. This is the stuff that honestly you pay a ton for in consulting, but you get for free today on Startup Wins. I've been thrown shares from different startup founders. They never ever cashed out or they didn't have their liquidity event. As a naive recipient of this, 1,000 shares, 100,000 shares, you don't realize that's $5. I guess you could kind of throw that out there and say, hey, you're vested. Yeah, you're going to be vested with 1,000 shares, but they have no clue, like it's 2 cents. So that's why I say that. Whereas if you have 100 shares at the beginning, it seems like it'd be kind of challenging to split those 100 shares into those tiny increments to get more people vested. So that's why I guess I throw out bigger numbers.
Yeah, I guess you just do a split later, right? So you're planning your cap table as you're planning the growth of your company. So that's the other thing is when you also go backwards and you say, okay, so what's my exit? If your exit is selling to a privately held company or whatever, that's one thing. If your exit is to go public, there's a range of public pricing that's acceptable, right? So you also have to be really cognizant of the fact that you don't want to overprice yourself. You don't want one share to be worth $1 million, right? When you go public.
Right.
I mean, because people like fractional shares, everybody kind of hates that. It just doesn't work that well. But you also don't want necessarily a crowded cap table either, right? To your point. Like you don't necessarily want to have, 500 people on your cap table before you've raised any money. So I like warrants for some of that, right? So there's the combination of warrants, there's the combination of, like I said, different kind of stock instruments, non-quals, qualified, those sorts of rules and different things, performance awards. You can do phantom awards. So you're actually giving somebody an incentive that's based on share price and share value. A little bit further down the line, I would say not right out of the gate, but like let's say you got an operating company and you've got this trajectory of things, and you say, well, hey, if you increase your sales, to a salesperson, you double your quota, I'm going to give you some shares worth this, or the share value of that, we're going to pay you out in cash. Cash is still awesome. People freaking love cash,
Sure.
Well, because you said it early on, you've gotten a lot of, stock that sitting in a pile over there that's not worth anything except for maybe a match, like a strike a match, like light it on fire.
Exactly.
So, again, you just really sit down with it and let it rest with you for a second, right? Take your cap table and say, how much do I want to have at the end? Who do I need to put on my team to get there, right? Like when I had my software company, I wasn't a software engineer. Hell no. I'm a financial person. I knew what the UI needed to do to a T, but I could not articulate. I mean, I could articulate some of it, but I couldn't certainly develop the software. So I had a team of software, 2 guys on my team that were founders as well. And they got shares. And I knew that I had to give them shares of this company to get them to come in and work with me on this. And I couldn't pay them, obviously, And so I had to work that backwards. Again, do that, The other thing is that, you also want to be conscious of taxes. I mean, taxing of stock is really, it's a real thing. I know companies that got into trouble because, they didn't do the right things. Do you do an 83B election? I'm not sure. It just really depends. And I would really set up your recipients of your stock with some thought. And I know a lot of companies are like, I'm not a tax expert. If you have any tax advice, you need to, So companies have taken a weird approach to stock over the years, which I think is interesting. So a lot of times, like we would never tell an employee what the value of their stock was when they left. Because I didn't want them to exercise.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's kind of weird if you think about it, right? Here you've got an employee who's earning these shares and you really don't want them to exercise because they're not going to be here anymore. And then those options go back in the pool and you can give them to somebody else.
Yeah.
Kind of a bizarre way to think about stuff. But again, you need to start thinking about that. We had A and B shares at Santa Fe Farms. So we had a voting block and we had a non-voting block.
Okay.
So that was kind of a way to handle that question that you had before too. So, hey, my disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, rules evolve, rules change, trends change, venture firms change. So if you have really funky things like I love double trigger. So when you exit a company, you can't have all your employees walking out when you are exiting the company, right? So if there's a change of control provision where, they accelerate all their options and they get a chance to walk out the door, that's not good for a buyer.
Yeah.
So you're going to see that in the price that you're getting for the company. You're going to see that ratchet down because they're going to have to now, on top of that, incentivize those people to stay. So that's why I like the double trigger is what it's called. So basically they accelerate or the company has the right, if they're coming in to buy it, to keep you on and keep you vesting under your same plan. So, a little bit of golden handcuffs.
So how come isn't there, I mean, why aren't there books out there written by you on this subject? I had the privilege to interview Kevin Henrikson, the former founder of the team that built the startup that eventually became the world's top email client. You know it, Outlook. He also headed up the engineering team at Instacart and gives some very incredible thoughts about hiring engineers.
What are some things that you actually look for in engineers, and what seemed to work?
Yeah. In a single word, it's curiosity. And that's never changed in 30 years of hiring engineers. And even myself, like I feel like one of my biggest traits is just this endless curiosity of how do things work? How do I figure it out? How do I solve it? How do I get to the next step? And so we look for engineers that are successful and curious. And obviously you want them to be smart and technical. And if they have other experiences, that's helpful in orienting them around solving problems that they may have seen before. But really the best startups and the hardest problems, you're not going to know. Like nobody has solved voice AI today, just like nobody had solved mobile email the way we had eventually solved it with Acompli and then Microsoft. You can't hire somebody to be like, oh, they're the best email expert, because all they're going to know how to do is the way it's been done for 20 years and not the way we think it's going to do in the next 20 years or even the next year. And so for us, it's you want people that are curious enough to like run into hard problems and then tenacious enough to want to go solve them. And part of that comes out in questioning, what they've done and how they've worked on it and how do they work with teams. And, so some of the questions that I ask are like, oh, you're on this team of 10 people. What were you, rank yourself? Were you the most senior person, the most junior person? And that answer doesn't matter as much as like, how do you interact with the team? Do you ask a lot of questions? When you have a question on something, what happens? And somebody like, well, I don't have a lot of questions. Everybody comes to me. You're like, oh, that's a good thing because you've kind of had a lot of curiosity, right? Like you've figured out stuff that other people haven't. And so those kind of questions tease out like, nobody's going to say, I'm like, are you a curious person? That's not it's too direct of a question to get the real answer. Where as they start to talk, they're like, oh, I'm really interested in this thing, or I have this deep obsession with building games and I've really built game companies and I have this side project that I've worked on forever that I'm very passionate about. And so this passion and connection, like all those are indications of curiosity, which will lead well, in our sense of like people that are, that are going to want to learn, that are going to want to like figure things out that haven't been figured out and that are also tenacious enough to lean into something and aren't afraid of like not knowing the answer or not knowing what's going to be figured out. So I think those are like, again, those are quick things. I think as you start and hire your first 5 engineers, you're looking for generalists that sort of can span front end, back end, new tech, old tech. And then as you get larger, so if you look at when, I'm hiring for the first 2 engineers at Acompli versus hiring for engineer 702 at Microsoft, now you're looking for people that are going to work well in a Microsoft environment. And then they're partly because of the funnel, Microsoft has access to all the top universities and all the top schools. And so we're recruiting, almost by default from pedigreed type schools and programs because we have those sort of relationships set up. And then you're looking inside of all those pedigreed, a lot of times at Microsoft, they're like, here's the hiring class of, there's 30 new hires and they're already hired. And now you're just almost recruiting them to be on out of that 30, which of those 2 do you want to join your team for this like hiring batch? And then, it's a little different question because now you're saying out of those 30, they've all passed the Microsoft test. They're all smart. They're all great. Many of them are returning interns. Which 2 are going to be the most successful? And then it's really filling out your team. Hey, I want somebody that's interested in data analytics or somebody that's interested in performance optimization. And so you're looking for indications that not only fit curiosity, but also map to like, kind of roles or positions on your team that you want to sort of almost like a draft, right? It looks more like a draft where you're like, oh, I really need a quarterback this time. Oh no, I need a defensive end, really struggling in the secondary, going to go recruit a safety, right? And so I think of it, hiring at larger companies in these pool-based models looks like that.
Kevin advocates hiring tenacious engineers as one of his tips for success. But I asked him, how do you figure that out in the interview process?
You mentioned tenacity as one of the qualities that you're looking for in engineers, but how do you dig up tenacity in the interviews, or can were there any things that would signal that kind of, I guess, quality in a person?
Yeah. So typically you look for things like, ask a question like, what's the toughest thing you had to solve in your last company? And then what did you do? Oh, I phoned a friend. Oh, I figured this out. Oh, I went to a conference. Oh, I Googled it. Just start to look like, okay, let them self-describe what the hard thing is. And just by them describing what that is, you'll know how much like in the shit they got. Like, oh, because if you're like, hey, I worked at this company for 5 years and I was, a mobile engineer, or I was a, backend engineer or a database engineer. And the trickiest thing I got was something that I don't classify as tricky out of all of the sort of pattern matching I've done. You're like, well, you never really got to something hard. So there's 2 reasons for that. One is that you just happened to be in a company where there was no hard things, but that's probably not true. It's probably there was hard things, but you never got assigned those projects, or you didn't find a way to get on that area, or you weren't the one tapped when it was like, we need to make this work. Game's on the line. 10 seconds left. We got 1 play and we're going to have to, who's getting the ball? If you're not the one getting that call, you probably haven't shown and demonstrated the skills that leaned you into being in those positions. And so a lot of those signals come out in like asking some of these questions of like, what was the hardest thing? What role did you play? How many times did you work late at night or early in the morning? So some of these, it depends, right? And those aren't always the signal, but that adds up to a set of things where you're like, oh, when we really need to make this happen, this client's problem, like, you'll have people say like, oh, well, we had one of our biggest clients looking to churn because they had a big outage. What did they do? And you're like, oh, I got to take notes in the meeting. They're like, no, they bought me a plane ticket and I was on the plane that night at 11 p.m. and I showed up at 6 a.m. in the customer's office.
Right.
And you're like, and again, this is like, pre-COVID world where that kind of stuff mattered. But those kind of things are where you're like, okay, there's an indication of like, you were the chosen one to get on the plane. You were the chosen one to go lead that. You were the one to bring the team together to design that. Those are attributes that are like, I've found work well in entrepreneurial type of ventures. And even when I'm hiring for big teams, I still want that entrepreneurial sort of high agency sort of viewpoint, even if I'm bringing you in as employee number 700 onto my team at Microsoft.
Kevin had the inside scoop on famous top brass of Microsoft since he had to work for them after the company bought his startup. He answers whether Steve Ballmer was truly crazy, as rumored, throwing chairs across rooms, and shares some really interesting tidbits about Satya Nadella and the intensity of Bill Gates. You'll want to listen to this.
Part of the reason why I was asking that question is because at least you'll see in the media, stories about Ballmer throwing a chair across the room. Maybe you've even experienced it.
Yeah, I worked with the guy. So I worked with the guy. He came to VMware afterwards because a lot of Microsoft guys came to VMware afterwards, and incredible engineer. And like, I think they would never like say, hey, whether it happened or not. He was like, yeah, it definitely happened. He was there, right? When he was in the room, he was the guy, right? And he, after VMware, I think he went to Google. But it's like, you look at that experience and you're like, again, there's a version of you ask him, you're like, oh, was that malicious or whatever? And like the media made it like, oh, Ballmer's crazy and throwing chairs and he's like, off the rocker. And again, I'm not going to put words in his mouth, but I would say some version of like, it's like the coach going in and screaming at the football team and throwing a helmet across the thing. You're like, could argue whether that's safe or correct or whatever. Yeah. But at the end of the day, like the people in the room that knew is like, the coach just wanted it as bad as we did. And like, there was that it was a competitive spirit kind of thing that was like, at some level, honor and respect, and not like, oh, there's this threatening thing being thrown across the room and it's, I'm pissed. It's like, he's that competitive and he wants to win that bad.
Right.
That he's, and you see him in the basketball games on the, when he was on the team and like on the floor, like he is an intense dude.
Yeah.
And like that level of competitiveness and to be able to run with Gates for those many years and really run the organization the way he did. Again, not to say he was as impactful or as effective as Gates or now, Satya, who was there when I was there, but very different styles, but all equally or arguably, Satya probably being the most effective of being able to do that without throwing chairs and out having.
Right.
Satya is an incredibly intense dude,
is he?
But doesn't show up that way. He's intense with the words and choice and how he leads. And it's a much quieter sort of leadership style where Ballmer's much more boisterous and Gates is also intense, like publicly, like has a great PR sort of face to him, but privately, the famous quote, "That's the stupidest fucking thing ever," is like, he's literally believes that. Yeah. And Steve's like, these guys are like that, man, these are just intense guys. And so I guess my sense is that intensity comes out in different ways. And again, like culture and sort of what's right and how woke people are and what the view of the culture and norms are has changed over the last few decades. But I think the underlying principle there of like, the best winners are hyper competitive and they're very intense, even though that intensity shows up in different ways for different people.
Lastly, Kevin gives some key advice on how to get the team aligned on the mission to truly grow the company.
Well, if you have that mindset, I would assume that they're also very independent in terms of the way they behave. And what I warned you about earlier was, how hard-ass do you have to be as their boss? And does that conflict, right? Because their way versus your way and how you guide them down that path.
Yeah. So I think for me, like, I'm an incredibly hands-off leader. So I like to have like a very small number of reports, even when these teams get very large. Like I think at Microsoft, when I had, like I said, many hundreds of people, I probably had 4 direct reports. Like 2 people had like basically half the team each. And then I had 2 people with smaller teams and then an admin. And I like it that way so that I can sort of ride above that and work across those without having to do a lot of the like day-to-day people management. And then when the teams are smaller, everybody reports to you in a more flat way. But I think I look for people and I want people reporting to me that don't need a lot of handholding and that are independent by choice. I think what you describe is this notion of like, if they're so independent that they're not shareholder aligned, right? Because no matter what company we're in, whether it's a small one and we're like, we're the shareholders because we're all startup employees, or it's a big one and, by proxy, we're all Microsoft shareholders, even in a small sense. But at the end of the day, like, if we're optimizing on shareholder value anywhere in the org, whether it's small company, big company, or super multi-conglomerate, that generally is an easy thing to get more budget for, more team support for, and hard to argue against as being wrong, right? You're like, is this driving shareholder value? You're like, oh, this doesn't really matter. We're working on some random bug system down in this random tool. You're like, yeah, but you should be able to draw a pretty direct line to like this adding shareholder value, or we're sort of just doing a bad job as stewards of capital of that. And so to me, the hard ass part comes in when you find people that are like, I'm wasting the company's money, or I'm a crazy like manic negotiator with vendors to a fault potentially. There's still vendors that they see me and they're like, oh, I ran into one a while back and he was like, oh, I remember that negotiation 7 years ago. You were the one that squoze us the hardest. And I always have this viewpoint that like part of being able to have those sort of hard negotiations or hard discussions is because you created a framework in your mind of where the value's at, and I think that applies to managing people, right? Hey, what do I value in a team member? I value in myself. I hold myself to the same standard. And so like my view is like, I'd rather have a smaller boat with bigger rowers than a huge boat of weak rowers. Right. And so like, to me, it's this idea that like, you want to look around and and you've worked on teams, you've been with companies, you look around and there's nothing worse than sitting on a boat rowing and looking over the guy next to you slacking or the woman next to you slacking. You're like, bro, like, let's go. And so lack of sense of urgency, lack of purpose, lack of drive, it's the worst thing for your high performers to have like mediocre or low performers sitting around them because it's demotivating.
Right.
Whereas the reverse is true where you see everybody and they're like, come on, man, row harder. You got that. Like, then you do row harder because you're like, we're in this together and everybody gives that extra 10%. And that, that's what makes the difference between winning and losing. I mean, there was 50 other email apps already running on the App Store. And there still is today. There's always 50 or 60 email apps on the App Store and probably even more if we, go out to ones that are kind of walking dead.
Right.
And we decided to start a new email app and somehow rose up to be the one that became, essentially the number one in the sense that we're, the email app representing the biggest email franchise in the world.
Right.
And so I think to find people like that and how to be a hard ass on them is if your hard assness is like, guys, like the goal is to win the race, don't break the boat and don't break your friends. But other than that, like no rules, like we're going as hard as we can. And you never, ever found the bottom. And I think that's something my, dad was in the military, like Navy. And so like, there was always this notion, if you look at like SEAL training or any of these like sort of survivor type views of like military stuff, like you always have more to give. Like when you finally are tired and your body's about to break, you're like 40% in, right? Or, there is like a deep, deep tank in human nature. And being able to find a way to sustainably access that deeper tank and motivate people, very hard to do that with a whip or a stick, right? It's got to be a carrot and it's got to come from within. Cause like I can even dangle lots of money in front of people and carrots. And like, honestly, like that's not going to trick your brain to be like, this is the time to go beyond what's comfortable. And so to me, the motivating factor is not like a hard ass and like, hey, you're carrying a big stick and banging on people or even carrying a big fishing pole with a carrot trying to drag people towards the reward or money. you have to create that internal sense of like, okay, we're living for a bigger purpose here and we're doing it together. And this notion of teams, and you see like the championship teams of any professional sport or any kind of like really competitive situation, it ends up being the winner, the ultimate winner in really competitive things is like they wanted it more. They had drive. They were hurt somewhere in life and they were willing to prove themselves. Like it's never like, oh, they just happened to show up and just happened to, no, they put in years
Right.
or decades of experience to know like what they were capable of and then also be able in that moment to find like that extra gear, that extra 10% that other people were like, it just wasn't possible.
In our most recent interview here in season 2, Alina Vandenberghe, co-CEO and founder of Chili Pepper, a company that once achieved unicorn valuation, tells a funny story about what happened on the way to becoming a startup founder.
Yeah, no, definitely. Well, tell us a little bit about maybe some of those things that you did break that maybe you learned a little bit from, or maybe some crazy stories along the way.
Oh my gosh, I got almost fired so many times. So I guess I can tell the story when I came here in US, because I came from Romania. I was not born in US. And I was a temp worker, like sort of like an intern. I was, I don't know, paid $15 an hour, I think. And I was one of the few people in the company at that time who had the experience, like a portfolio in mobile. I had done that for free in my in the evenings with all sorts of other entrepreneurs. I'd built a portfolio of mobile apps. And Thomson Reuters had the opportunity to be included in the launch of the iPad before the iPad was launched. And they didn't have like employees that knew much about it, but I was very like ready to take that project on. We had to sign an NDA. It was in basement with no windows. We had access to the iPad before anybody had the iPad. It was just me and 2 other people with a key to that room, and nobody else knew what we were doing in that room. So we built an app. We added some video on it. We added news. We had financial information and charts, and like we made it super cool. But we hadn't heard back from Apple if they would approve of us or not. We didn't hear much of feedback until when the day of the launch, we see that Steve Jobs keynotes our app and decides to pre-install it on all iPads out there, Thomson Reuters news app. So all of a sudden, Reuters got 30 million users out of the out of the deal, out of the iPad app that it was me and another guy that built together. And nobody knew, like nobody knew inside of the company that that's what I was doing in the basement. I was like an intern. And after I got some I remember I was interviewed by a New York Times journalist. What did I do? How did I go about the process? The app was everywhere in Times Square. I thought, oh, I made it in America. Because it was a great thing, a great story. And then like 3 days after, I was called in the office by my boss at that time. And he said, Alina, you did great with this app, but you're not a team player, so you're fired.
Oh my God.
He was right. He was right. Like I was not a team player. I was in the basement, not talking to everybody. So yeah, those are like some things that happened to me through the journey.
And lastly, Alina tells us what types of people really are the ones that should be startup founders. I think you'll enjoy hearing this.
Well, what inspired you to kind of go and launch this company? You obviously had done a lot of successful, jobs before, but what made you like, now I'm going to go run my own company?
Well, traditionally, the corporate America that I was part of, and I was part of publicly traded companies, I was part of some larger startup as well, is not great for people that are entrepreneurial like me, because there's a lot of red tape, there's a lot of constraints on how fast you can move and how much you can break. And I'm definitely one that moves with a lot of speed. I'm definitely one that breaks things a lot, and there was no space for that.
So you wanted to do a little more breaking with no restraints, basically, right?
Yes. Well, if you want to create great things, you cannot go with a traditional playbook, right? You have to walk off the edges and like try things that have not been tried before. And usually those things are scary for most people. But what I think was different about entrepreneurs and the rest of the world is that entrepreneurs, they're okay and comfortable with breaking things. They're okay with taking the big risks. And I'm definitely very, very, very comfortable with high risks. Yeah.
So that wraps it up for this special episode here in season 2. We're taking a break this week, heading home to surprise my aunt for her 90th birthday. So I thought I would take some time off, share some really incredible parts of past interviews, including the most recent interview with Alina. I hope you enjoy. And I just want to say from the bottom of my heart, thank you for listening to Startup Wins. I hope you truly get the benefits that I did by listening to these incredible, incredible folks that have built companies, including unicorns, or companies that became unicorns, or even companies that become so ubiquitous that we all know what they are. We'll tune in for more episodes of Startup Wins coming up in a couple weeks. Try to get this episode out every 2 weeks for you so that you can continue to build your incredible startup and impact the world. Take care.